Hello everyone and welcome to Elevate My Chess game analysis series. Today we will be taking a look at a game from the Candidates Tournament, which is the biggest ongoing event in the moment. And this is a game from round 8 and it was played between Fabiano Caruana and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. So this was the game that left all commentators and viewers amazed because not only did it include an amazing opening novelty, but it also made a very valuable contribution to endgame theory. So let's see how it went. It all started with a Sicilian Najdorf, and by move 8 we're going to see that this is the poison pawn variation in the Najdorf, and Black's queen is coming to b6 to attack the pawn on b2, and eventually he does take the pawn on b2, and the reason why it has its name, the poison pawn variation, is that the pawn in b2 was given away for free, but things are not as simple. So white will have a compensation for the pawn, and it will be seen through his better piece development. So white develops some of his pieces, and black has to spend some time retreating the queen from there. And because white has an advantage in development, he will try to open up the center and start an attack on the black's king. So the game continued with h6, bishop h4, some trades happening in the center. Now black played knight f to d7 here. Knight to d5 was another theoretical line, and it would have been rather unclear after something like e6. And again, white is sacrificing some pawns to open up some files and diagonals close to the black king, and white is going to try to create some sort of attack in compensation for those pawns. But in the game, knight f to d7 happened, which led to a different type of position, and here white sacrificed a second pawn already, the one on a2, and black ended up taking it, and this is all still a theoretical line that both players knew and they were both prepared for. So these pawn sacrifices have been deliberate, and black is taking them because he's already aware that he's down, that he's behind in development, and so he might as well get the most material he can for it. So the game continues with rook d1, queen d5, queen e3, and queen to e5. So at this point we see that Caruana gave away 3 pawns, which is a lot of material, but at the same time, if we take a look at all of black's pieces, his only developed piece is his queen on e5. Everything else, he has 5 pieces on their initial starting positions, which compensates for white's lack of 3 pawns, but at the same time, it is not that simple, because if white doesn't develop a strong attack, doesn't prove his compensation for those 3 pawns, then later in the middle game and in the end game, those 3 pawns will be quite a significant material advantage that black will be able to convert. So white has to act quickly and get the rest of his pieces into the game and create an attack. So the game continues. White keeps attacking the black queen. It goes to d5, and this was the moment where the opening novelty came as a surprise to everyone, and it was bishop to c4. So despite being down 3 pawns, Caruana decided to sacrifice a full piece and slow down black's development even further. So the idea of the sacrifice is that once the queen takes it, the white bishop has this d6 square that just got opened up, and from here on it will prevent black from castling, and it will become really difficult for black to play. So this is what happened in the game, but the reason why he did not exactly want to play bishop d6 right away might have been because black can simply take it, and now this is the tactics here get a little complicated, but here is the line of how it could have went. So knight goes to b5. This is a discovered attack on the black queen, and so if the queen moves away anywhere, then white is simply taking back the bishop and regaining the material. So black will probably sacrifice the queen on d1, and something like this would be, again, rather unclear, where we have an imbalanced position where white has a queen against a rook, a piece, and 3 pawns, I believe. So this would have been rather complicated. So instead, Caruana and his team came up with this bishop c4 move, which was really unexpected, and it was an opening novelty. So no one at a high level that we know of has played this before. So now the bishop came to d6 and prevented black from castling, and eventually white did get back the piece that he sacrificed, the one on c5. So it wasn't possible for black to capture the bishop because of knight recapturing it back and making a fork on the king and the queen. So this was not possible for black, but at the same time he has to continue his development or else his king will be stuck in the center forever. So that's why he played knight to f6, and the game went on with knight d5, queen e5. So the queen from e5 is attacking the g7 pawn, and black had to defend it. In case he doesn't defend it and tries to go for this queen c3 check, he will eventually run out of checks. So he can do a few more, but at the end of the day, white has this rook d3 move and black is out of checks. So he had to protect his pawn on g7, which was a good choice. And now there is a sacrifice coming up with knight to e6. So as you can tell, black's king is stuck in the center, so it is time for white to open it up, even if it costs him a piece. The tactics do work out in white's favor in case black actually takes that piece with the bishop. So if this happens, then queen to e6 is going to be an attack on both the black king and the rook, and so white will end up winning the rook on g8. So taking was not good, and MVL here decided to play queen c3 and trade queens. Now, you may think that trading queens is beneficial for black, and that is true, because black was the one under attack, and so trading queens definitely reduces white's attacking chances by a lot. But this did not come without a cost, and that cost was the rook on a8, because right now white has the opportunity to play knight to c7 and capture the rook on a8 eventually. Except not right away, because if white does that, then keep in mind that white was already down quite a bit of material before this whole variation happened, and at the end of this, white could be down 2 pawns in the endgame. So had he taken the rook on a8, black can take back his rook on d1, and this is not a good endgame for white. So he played rook to d3 instead, from where the rook on a8 is still under attack, but so is the knight on c3. So now MVL played knight to e4, and after this move, Caruana took his first long think during the game. So this suggests that everything before this, every single move, he had it all planned, and that was part of his home preparation, which is quite amazing that he made it all the way to move 26. It was quite a successful preparation, because he got a fairly good position in the endgame. So he probably was expecting rook a7, and at this point we would have seen something like this, where white is down 2 pawns, except the rook on a7 is really not at its best square, and it is almost trapped, and white will still have some attacking ideas on the black king, because it is, again, not at its best square. So white's pieces are a lot better placed, and that would compensate for the 2 pawns. So instead, knight e4 happened in the game, so black decided to transpose into an endgame with equal material. So if you look at the material here, white has a rook against a knight and 2 pawns, and it is probably a fairly balanced endgame. Both sides have some ideas to go for, so black would probably be trying to push his pawns on the queen side because he has the extra 2 pawns there, and white will be trying to make the most of his piece activity because his 2 rooks and a bishop are a really good combination. So later, a few more moves are played. Everything is logical. No one is making any mistakes, and we have this endgame that came up where the material is equal, but black's defense actually became more difficult from here on because black's pawns are separated, so the pawn on h6 and the pawn on f6 can both potentially be weaknesses, and it is really difficult to push his pawns on the queen side because the rooks are really good at preventing passed pawns. So at this point, h4 was played, so he was trying to gain more space on the king side, and h5. So this move, it wasn't necessarily bad, but it did create a weakness on h5, which white immediately went to attack with rook to g5. So the pawn on f6 is pinned, so it is not possible to recapture that rook, and the rook is attacking on h5, to which there is no defense. But instead, black decides to start attacking white's h-pawn. And it all results in some sort of a trade where black takes the h4 pawn and white takes the h5 pawn. And again, a few more moves are made. White does end up winning another pawn on b7. And so far, we have a fairly calm endgame until a certain moment. So here, black was forced to trade rooks because if he doesn't, f6 would have fell, and then a6 right after it. So rook c6 was forced, and now after this rook trade, we get to another interesting endgame. So let's fast forward a few moves. White did manage to win the pawn on a6. And we get to this position. So technically, it's rook versus knight, which means that white is up on points. But according to table base, this position is actually a draw. So this should be a theoretical draw, but in practice, it turned out to be a lot more difficult to defend than anticipated. So essentially, white's winning idea here is to bring his king to h5. That's the key square here that we will see both players will battle for the next probably 20 moves. So once white pushes away the black king and puts his own king on h5, from h5 the king will be able to access the g6 square and get closer to the pawn. So that's why the h5 square is really important, because it's basically a route towards winning black's f-pawn. So once the king reaches h5, the game immediately turns from drawn to winning. So this is why Fabiano really tried to take control of that h5 square for so long. And black's idea is essentially not to let the king get there and make sure that he doesn't get himself into a zugzwang, and basically just keep the fortress and not make any sudden moves and wait for white to prove that he can win this. So like I said, it is supposed to be a draw, but as we often see, endgames are a lot more complicated than they seem. So now the rook came to a3, which was a nice idea because now the rook is coming to g3, and this basically cuts off the black king and gives more chances for white to get to that h5 square. So the king gets closer. Now the knight, notice how the knight went to f5 from where it's protecting the g3 square, which is where the rook wanted to go. But eventually black had to give it up. move the knight somewhere else. So here maybe a better defensive technique would have been knight to e7, and the whole point is that the king might actually be better off on h7, which looks fairly strange, as it seems, because the king looks so much safer and closer to the f pawn on f7. But the point is that actually this king has no entry point towards this f6 pawn. So he can't go to f5 because the knight is protecting it, and he can't go to those two squares either because of the pawn. And going all the way somewhere like this would just take way too long, and Black would have time to consolidate by that point. So the king on h7 is actually doing fairly well, and it can go to h6 from there and defend that h5 square. And so something like this was probably a fairly good defensive chance for Black. But instead, he played knight to h6, which places the knight in a slightly awkward position, and we'll see why that later got him into a zugzwang. So the king went back to f7, and so they both maneuver around for a bit, and the king goes to f4. So the reason why he can't go to h5 immediately was because Black is simply going to repeat after him, and just if he goes to h4, then king to h6, and he can't really get to h5 at this point. So that's why king f4 for now, waiting for the right moment. And eventually, as we'll see, White shuffles around, and finally, after a few moves, White did manage to put Black into zugzwang. So now the king can finally reach the h5 square. King went to g4, and now the reason why king to g6 is not a valid defensive technique anymore is because king h4, and the king cannot go to h6 because his knight on g8 would be hanging, so he would be forced to retreat either to f7 or to h7. So this is how the king would still get a hold of the h5 square. So the game continued like this: knight e7 and king to h5. So the king has finally reached its dream destination, and now the position is winning, even according to table base, because the king has a lot of access squares starting from h5, and it keeps pushing the Black king further. So to give a few examples of what Black could try to do, something like f5 would likely not work out too well. For example, this g4 idea exists here, and the pawn can keep pushing with g5 and eventually become a strong passed pawn. So that would be definitely winning for White. And if knight to d5, then this is how the game actually continued. It was rook to f3, king e6, g4. So it's not king to g6 just yet, because because Black still has some checks to give. So he just took away that f5 square right away, and he resigned just in a few moves after king e5 and king to g6. So the reason why Black already resigned here is that the White king got exactly where it's supposed to be, and the f pawn is going to fall soon. So the knight can't move away, the king doesn't have many good squares, and White can have many tactics that lead to a transposition into a winning pawn endgame. So if he can ever sacrifice his rook for knight and a pawn, then the g pawn will grant a winning pawn endgame. So that was basically the whole game, and I think he can give us a few valuable conclusions. So the first one is to keep in mind this interesting opening idea, because it demonstrates that material isn't always the most important thing, and that there are other factors like piece development and king safety that can that can be extremely important in the opening, the middle game, and can sometimes be more important than material. And the second thing is that endgames are a lot more complicated than they look at first glance. So I would encourage everyone to remember this type of endgame and also the opening idea from this game, because this knowledge could potentially save you an important half a point or even a full point during a game sometime in the future. So I hope you enjoyed this game, and till next time.